So who would do this? Who would design these buildings for aircraft impacts but no jet fuel fires? Well, the answer is not the World Trade Center's design engineer. These towers were designed by a man named John Skilling. And Skilling had this to say in 1993 when asked if he considered the plane crashes in his design. This was 5 years before his death, after the first bombing of the World Trade Center. He said, "Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel would dump into the building." And he went on, "but the building structure would still be there." So the guy who designed the buildings said the building structure would still be there. Okay? He had a lot of confidence in his design. These are some pictures from the construction of these buildings. Actually, the core, which is essentially a self-standing core, went up first, and then the perimeter of the building went up around that. The core columns here were these super massive columns, and they went up 47 columns in the middle, and around them were these super strong columns because they were made of super strong steel. And all these columns were strapped together by what are called spandrels. So they formed a web, this super strong web of steel. And a lot of people talked about the reason that the planes could hit the buildings and not cause a problem because it was this web, and the forces would just go around the hole. They would just be directed around the hole by the columns and the spandrels. But just to get this out of the way, steel melts at approximately 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and jet fuel fires burn in the maximum of approximately 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit unless in a special combustion chamber, and even at that, just a few hundred degrees higher than that. It's important to remember that gas temperatures are not steel temperatures. Steel temperatures in a fire actually lag behind in time and in magnitude of the temperature from gas temperatures. And thermodynamic calculations, which, by the way, as far as I know, none of the official investigations ever did, but I've done and other people have done, show that the steel temperatures in the impact zones could have reached a maximum of 600 degrees Fahrenheit.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
And I don't think our reaction was that the buildings would fall, and that's why we maintained under the pedestrian overpass, which is only about 100, maybe 150 yards from the first building.
I don't think anybody was thinking the buildings might fall. We'd been told that these buildings were tested for a 707 and all of that. I mean, good grief, of course we didn't think it was going to fall. The fire trucks and the cops were right under there. As that thing started to collapse.
I was just thinking about this not long after the World Trade Center bombing. The engineer who designed the World Trade Center told me that the World Trade Center was designed to withstand a 707 direct impact. Well, obviously, that wasn't the case.
It seems not.
I don't think anybody could have even remotely imagined that those two towers would ever come down as the world watched 48 hours ago.
This is what happened mid-morning today after the towers had been hit by the plane. They simply began to collapse. First tower number 2, which took the most severe hit, that's the one that had the huge fireball. The architect who designed these buildings later told NBC's George Lewis that the heat was so intense that the structural steel in a building like that will melt within 3 or 4 hours. Well, the heat was so intense it melted in a shorter time than that. Then the second one went down.
It wasn't the explosion, the force of the two planes, structural engineers tell us. It was the heat. The flames there burned too long and too hot, rising above 1,500 degrees. It began to melt the steel.
Hyman Brown was the project engineer on the Twin Towers, the man on the ground in charge of making sure the buildings were built right, the way it was designed.
There was a lot of pride in it.
And we were doing something that hadn't been done before. But no one ever considered any types of forces like this.
Brown, who spent 6 years building the towers from day one in 1966, says the planes didn't cause the towers to collapse, but rather the fire and tremendous heat that exposed the steel superstructure to forces it could not withstand.
Structural steel is fireproof to last between 1 and 2 hours, which it did, and then steel melts.
110-story twin towers, which we now know disintegrated because when that jet went into the middle of the building, the temperature from all of that fuel so hot that it literally melted the steel there, which caused reinforced concrete floors beginning on about the 82nd story to pancake one into another, leaving room for little more than butter between the stacks. And now you see the dust, said to be 6 to 12 inches deep throughout all of lower Manhattan, and here, 5 feet of rubble.
The girders or the joists that hold up the floors collapsed, and as those fell to the floor below, they overwhelmed the capacity of that floor, and we had what we call a progressive collapse, which then continued on through the base of the building until it was a complete and total failure.
Just a side note to that story, the Wall Street Journal reporting today that the steel in those buildings is designed to accept 800 degrees temperature, melts at 1,500 degrees, and the jet fuel fire produced 2,000 degrees.
Viewed from another angle, you can see the same thing. Notice the aerial stays vertical, just stays straight as it sinks into the building. There's no buckling or tipping, just straight down. And this happened in both buildings. The first tower, too, stayed straight as it went down, each floor falling neatly on top of the other. So the reason the towers went so quickly is because all the floors were literally hanging onto the skin. And once the skin went, the buildings went too.
Now, unlike most conventional skyscrapers, which have lots of interior columns to give strength to the building, the exterior walls of the World Trade Center bore most of the load, so the direct attacks were enough to weaken the buildings and lead to their collapse.
Well, frankly, it's hard to imagine a building having more steel than this structure.
The innovative design was like a square donut. The strength was in the steel columns of the outer walls and the steel of the central core. At the beginning, the towers seemed incredibly stable, each apparently absorbing the impact of a Boeing 767 traveling at close to 500 miles an hour. The explosion of jet fuel that followed was the equivalent of a massive bomb. Still, the towers stood. The blazing jet fuel, however, created fires burning hot enough to weaken the steel that held the World Trade Center high.
Wasn't the shaking? It was fire. It was definitely the fire that took the building down.
As the fire burned on, experts say, temperatures rose above 1,000 degrees to the point where steel loses its strength.
Once it began to fail, it dragged in the floors and proceeded to pancake floor by floor so that the entire building collapsed, which was not necessary.
The girders or the joists that hold up the floors collapsed, and as those fell to the floor below, they overwhelmed the capacity of that floor, and we had what we call a progressive collapse, which then continued on through the base of the building until it was a complete and total failure.
Once it began to fail, it dragged in the floors and proceeded to pancake floor by floor so that the entire building collapsed, which was not necessary.